All right, happy Monday.
Happy Monday. How's it going, Joe?
Doing great. I missed you last week.
Yes, I'm feeling a lot better this week. So, illness does strike once in a while, not COVID, fortunately.
Yeah, so for the audience, Matt was out last week. I'm not going to tell you with what, but he was talking. Might not have been a good idea. So
Would have been exhausting. It could have been done, but I'm glad that you took it last week. So,
yeah,
much appreciated.
yeah, and I got a lot of good feedback on that episode. So and I think we're going to touch on something this week that is probably going to resonate with data engineers as well. Do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, so this week we're going to be talking about cloud data certifications, and we'll get into more of the details of what we mean by that. But broadly, it's like any kind of certification that helps you to learn about a cloud-based data tool or a cloud-based data ecosystem.
Yep. And so, I mean, why would anyone want to get a certification? It seems like a lot of work.
It is a lot of work, and I think there's a lot of skepticism too about certifications. I think there's a lot of cynicism around their value. Some people view them as kind of a marketing pitch. From my perspective, I think there are two main reasons to get cloud certifications related to data, and more broadly related to cloud if you're not into data. One is just to signal your acquisition of skills and knowledge, and also your ambition. So if a hiring manager sees that you've taken the time to get a pro level Google Cloud Data Engineering certification, for example, that means a lot. That means that you were busy at your job and yet you still took the time to study and pay money and go take the test. But on top of that, on top of signaling, I've taken quite a few cloud certifications now, and every time I learn something new that I just was not learning in my day-to-day work or consulting. So, for example, I just completed the Google Cloud Professional Data Engineer Certs on Thursday night,
Congratulations.
actually. It
It's a
was
hard
exhausting.
test. Yeah, that's a
It
hard
was a
test.
hard
It's
test.
the second time passing it, actually.
Yeah. Well,
So,
it's dramatically different. If you took the old version, they've
hmm.
changed a lot of stuff. But I learned a huge amount about machine learning and streaming data and BigQuery. And I work in BigQuery all the time, but I learned a lot of new things just while studying for this exam.
Hmm.
So I think number two of gaining new skills, gaining new insights, gaining more broad knowledge of best practices, you should really think about that. But then also one is going to help you in your career path. That is just signaling that you're ambitious, that you know things deeply beyond just superficially by learning them day to day in your job.
Yeah, it's something we see quite a bit too with people working in the cloud
Yeah,
and sort of approaching it sort of piecemeal, but
right.
maybe not having the overarching knowledge of how that particular cloud wants you to do stuff. And this is a very intentional way of saying each cloud has its way of wanting you to do stuff. When you get into AWS your first time, it is going to be a different experience than maybe if you've just simply run software in your own data center or maybe just your laptop or anything that's not AWS. If you're coming from Azure into AWS or AWS into Azure, it's going to be different experiences in all of these. GCP, Google Cloud is the same way. Um, and so if you're going to be very active in these clouds, I think Matt and I violently agree that it behooves you to take the time, understand the, definitely the fundamentals of what these clouds, um, how they want to be treated. It's like a pet. There's a certain temperament to these things, and if you understand the best practices of these clouds and cloud in general, you're going to be much better off.
That's right. I mean, I would argue that if you move to the cloud and you aren't doing things in a cloud specific way, you really are doing it wrong. And that means two different things. So, first of all, it means that you're not, like you said, you're not taking advantage of what that cloud really has to offer. And number two, you're probably going to cost yourself a lot of money. So, one place we've seen this is that someone has experience with Hadoop, for example. They've run a Hadoop cluster before for marketing data. And so they move to a new company. They're like, well, I want Hadoop. So they go buy a Cloudera license and they spin up Hadoop on AWS, on EC2. And what happens? Well, they end up spending a ton of money. And the infrastructure they built is not reliable because EC2 isn't really designed for this use case. The right way in general to do Hadoop on AWS is to use their managed service version or someone else's managed service version and to use S3 combined with Hadoop.
Yep.
And I won't get super deep into the advantages of that, but there are huge advantages to using managed Hadoop with S3 on AWS over doing it on-prem.
Hmm.
And they cost themselves a ton of money. So they're spinning up like 10 nodes and leaving them running 24 hours a day. It's very expensive. And yeah, they don't get the performance advantages of auto scaling with these managed services.
Well, I mean, to play devil's advocate, do you need
Yeah.
a certification to tell you that, or could you just go and figure that out on your own?
You can definitely figure it out on your own. The nice thing about the certification is that it forces you to figure it out, right? Like you're forced to learn. If you're on AWS, you're going to learn a lot about Elastic MapReduce, which is their version of managed Hadoop. If you're on Google Cloud, you're going to learn a lot about Dataproc, which is Google's version of managed Hadoop.
Hmm.
In addition, you'll learn about things that you have no clue about. The problem is in the tech industry, we don't know what we don't know, right? You have no clue what a lot of these managed cloud services are because you've had no occasion to study those cloud services. And the cert forces you to develop that knowledge base of best practices. And then you can assess. There might be use cases where you still choose to go to Cloudera, for example, but you'll at least know what's out there and what the standard best practices are.
Yeah, let me just quickly share something real
Yeah,
quick because I think it sort of highlights this point here.
yeah.
So, this is Amazon. This is all the products they offer, across a suite of areas. I mean, crap, they even have stuff for blockchain and quantum database ledgers and stuff, right?
It's
But
vast.
for you to go in and I think, you know, pick the right product coming into it cold, um, I think you'd be pretty lucky to make a good decision and know how to architect all these pieces together, right? I mean, the database options alone. Are you familiar with what Aurora is or RDS? How are these two related? What about Redshift? How does this relate to a relational database? What
How
about
about Glue
Neptune?
for processing data?
Glue, exactly, right?
Yeah,
And this is just data. This doesn't even include stuff like apps, Amplify, for example, and so forth. There's just, we've often heard the AWS, offerings is kind of the Cheesecake Factory menu of tools, and I think it might be appropriate. It's just because there's a lot of options, and if you don't know how all these things tie together, from a networking standpoint, from a permissioning standpoint, from an integration standpoint, and so on and so on and so on. It's going to be really difficult to, I think, make an architecture that is secure, reliable, scalable, and so forth. And so the certification definitely provides you with a good context of how to fit all these pieces together. Um, and this is I think it's a valid point. Like I don't know that you need to go and take the certification necessarily, but if you go through the study materials that are provided, maybe for the AWS, architect exam, for example, solutions architect, even the associate level, even the cloud practitioner, frankly. I mean,
yeah.
that's a pretty simple exam, but it's like just being able to attach names to situations and to applications.
And contextualize, like put them
Contextualize.
into a bigger mental framework. Yeah,
And then, say you're going cross cloud. Well, now you got to kind of know, okay, so if you're GCP and AWS, we see this often. How's
yeah.
that going to work? And then say you tack on Snowflake into AWS or any of these clouds. Now you got to understand how Snowflake does stuff, right? And then how does Snowflake want you to do things? And what's the best ways of handling Snowflake? And then how does Snowflake interact with stuff like S3? How do I get data in my AWS environment into Snowflake? This sort of presupposes you would know about S3 best practices, data ingestion best practices in AWS in order to get things into Snowflake. When would I want to use Snowpipe, for example, in Snowflake? So all these questions come up. Thankfully, the certification process just sort of makes it a really efficient way of accelerating your knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah, and they're not exhaustive. Even if you take any of the AWS Pro certs, and they don't boil the ocean, they don't cover all possible data technologies in that domain, but they just kind of give you this framework of how the different technologies fit together and when you might want to use them. And then when it is time to deploy them, you can dig a little bit deeper, but at least you have that big mental framework of how things work that will prevent a lot of grief, frankly. I
Hmm.
mean, with Snowflake, for example, I think that Snowflake is an extremely well-designed product, but every deployment I've been on, we've run into a lot of pain around permissions. The certification will help you to at least get a big picture of how Snowflake permissions work. And this is important for two reasons. So first of all, it allows you to fix problems as they arise. And second, it's going to prevent a lot of disasters, security disasters, for example, which is another thing that also happens in the cloud. People move into the cloud, everything is so easy, and they screw up permissions, right? And they cause a data leak or they cause infrastructure to go down.
Hmm.
Certifications will help you to prevent those problems.
Yeah, and I would say some of the stuff, if you're coming into the clouds, or even if you are in the cloud and don't feel comfortable, it's like
Yeah.
things I think we'd recommend learning is definitely. So if you're a data scientist, for example, right? I mean, the temptation is, oh, I'm just going to go into SageMaker and just start playing in that, which is fine. Except you're going to come into a situation where you're going to have to think about IAM roles. Okay, so like, what does SageMaker have access to? Understanding how IAM works, that is, I think, a very underrated skill. Understanding how
Yes.
policies work, all this other stuff like permissioning, security. You're not going to get very far in SageMaker if you don't have roles set up. So,
Well, and what happens is that people without that knowledge just grant all permissions,
yeah,
which again can lead to a huge disaster
like
for
yeah, like yeah,
but
you use your root account in in production, for example, right?
yeah,
Or I think one thing that's pretty notorious, like publicly available S3 buckets,
again and again.
again and
Yeah.
again. EC2 servers with ports open to anywhere through
Yep.
SSH. That happens. So,
Databases that are open to the world you can just
mhm.
access without credentials.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this might be one of these things where we have to give a maybe a little mini course to people on this because it just these are the kinds of things that we think of. But even if you just took the time to learn about these things, either through certification or not, just understanding how these clouds want you to do stuff is going to save you a lot of trouble. And that's why we think certification is actually probably a more efficient way because at least now you're forced into learning this in potentially a time-bound manner. So it's like you have to get this done and you have to know this
Yep.
stuff.
Yeah. And that's where you commented you could just go through the study process. But my thought is if you're going to put in the work to actually study, just go force yourself to do the certification. Because first of all, just having that as a forcing function to get your knowledge up to a certain level makes a difference in how well you learn the material.
Hmm.
And second, if you're going to do the work, you might as well have it on your resume. You might as well be able to tell the world, hey, look, I
Yeah.
have the certification. You can put it on LinkedIn. You likely will get reach outs from recruiters based on the certifications that you have because they are very valuable now from a financial perspective and from a job hunting perspective.
Actually, let me talk about that real quick.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is Dice. I do a lot of job data analytics, and
So that
well,
one's
let's.
interesting, right? Google
Mhm.
right now is the
Yeah,
most
but
valuable
this has
cert.
been consistently the same. I would say consistently the top certification. Across many resources too. So it's not just Dice. I mean, if you're looking at PC Mag,
Yeah.
I think this is as of 2020. Okay, well, looky here. Uh, so I don't know if this. The same again, 2021. It's a pretty funny comment here. AWS Cloud Practitioner, they can expect to make an average of 131. Yeah, I mean, some of this I would say take with a grain of salt. The Cloud Practitioner exam
Right.
isn't that hard.
Yeah.
But the point is, right, coming up behind it, Solutions Architect Associate, this actually was one of the higher paying certs. I think maybe the highest paying cert a few years back. So, point is, when you're looking at things like this, let me see, one, two, that one, and so forth. You know, uh, Certs are worth money. So to your point, I think for us, right, if I see somebody who has, so let me ask you this question, Matt. If you saw somebody who had the GCP data engineering cert, would you question their ability to do most data engineering things in GCP?
Yes and no, right? There's more to data engineering than the certs, but I would know that they did the work to get that cert. I mean, anytime I see someone with one of these certs, I'm automatically impressed because they took the time to do it. It's so much work to get one of these certifications, but
But I
they
suppose like what
acquired basic
specifically would
knowledge.
uh, what specifically though would make that certification attractive to you, like their certification attractive to you?
Yeah, it means that. So if it's the Google cert, for example, it means that they've learned a lot about BigQuery. They've learned a lot about the whole family of GCP data related services. They've learned a lot about permissioning, and they've taken the time to prove that knowledge by taking the exam. It doesn't mean necessarily that they have really deep experience in those technologies, but that I can interview for, right? I can see if they just, there are cases where people just take a cert without really having the contextual knowledge to fully understand what's going on. But if they combine the certification with the proper experience on a job, then I know that they're a pretty solid candidate for a position in
Well,
data
let's take that
engineering.
situation though. Okay, so
Yeah.
say you have candidate A
Mm-hmm.
who doesn't have a cert but claims to have GCP experience
Yeah, exactly.
versus a candidate B who has a cert and claims to have
Fine.
experience. Who are you going to
Yeah,
pick?
exactly right. All things being equal, I'm going to pick the certified candidate
Hmm.
because they've taken the time to prove their knowledge and to deepen their studies. Because typically, in addition to having experience on GCP, the certifications cover a lot of material. And so you do have to do a lot of extra work beyond just your work experience to get that certification.
Yeah,
And
like
I
I
know
think.
that they've taken the time to do that.
Yeah, I agreed. Like I think
Yeah.
it would be hard to pass maybe the GCP like cloud architect exam or
Yeah.
the data engineering exam, which is a lot deeper. Like if you came into that cold and tried to pass it,
Oh, no, no, no.
you wouldn't
Good
pass
luck.
it, right? Like,
Yeah.
you would be lucky. It would be like the 50,000 monkeys like eventually writing Shakespeare. Like it could happen. I kind of doubt it's going to happen in your case, not you, but the person's case because you
No,
passed it,
not me
right?
either. Yeah.
So, but the point is with these sort of certs, like it's hard to pass it without having at least some hands-on knowledge of these products and how they
Yeah.
interoperate. The way the questions are formulated are very subtle and very and require very specific knowledge that you would only get if you took the time to understand, kind of what's going on between the lines of these questions.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So,
You need to have some experience to understand how the cloud works. I guess my caveat would be that um, I'm more of like a BigQuery specialist, right? So I don't use Cloud Bigtable all the time. Cloud
mhm.
Bigtable I was on the exam. So that's more peripheral knowledge for me that I had to really study up on. So I'd want to know, I'd want to hear from the candidate, okay, so you passed the cert. That actually means a lot. What are you specialized in? Like what parts of GCP data engineering have you really spent your time on? Does it align
Yeah.
with what I'm looking for? But that
Hmm.
combination of the right experience plus the cert is very
Yeah, and that's
meaningful.
going to kind of self-select too, right? Because in a
Yeah.
job description, it's not like saying, "Oh, I just need you to know like GCP,"
Right.
right? I mean,
It's
typically you're going to say, "So I need somebody who's good at Bigtable, for example, or somebody who's good at
right.
Dataflow or BigQuery or whatever," right? And saying
Streaming.
AWS, right? Like, technologies are typically listed: Redshift, Kinesis, whatever, like 2 million other products that AWS has. But the whole
Yeah.
point is like you can definitely tell like through the job description what somebody's looking for. So, and I guess if somebody's looking for like just general cloud skills, like as a data, for a data engineer job, then you might want to evaluate that more closely as a candidate talking
Yeah.
to a prospective hire or a company. So,
Yeah. Definitely interview the hiring manager and say, what are you actually looking for? Are you looking for someone to build out a cloud team? Is that what this is about? Are you starting from nothing and just take that into account in your decision about that job? There are
yeah,
lots of jobs like that, right? Where they just need someone to come in and say, we've made the decision to go to GCP, but we don't know anything. We need someone to take the lead with some
because in
knowledge
a
and
lot, and we're
experience.
seeing this more and more in job
Yeah.
descriptions though too,
Yeah.
where it's like we just need somebody who has a certification, like a pro level certification, which we'll touch on in a bit, the distinction between those two.
Yeah.
But in any of the clouds, whether it's Azure, AWS, GCP, shit, even Oracle these days is popping up.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and do you want to talk about the difference between what are called pro, specialty, and then associate level certs?
Yeah. So each of the, let's start with the associate level certs. So I think our main emphasis today is on three different clouds or technologies. So AWS, GCP, and Snowflake. Snowflake at this point isn't a cloud; it runs across several
When you
clouds.
talk about
But
us, like us, you and I,
and
yeah.
we'll probably get into other. We'll probably dig into Azure more on a future call after doing more research. Something I have some experience with, less experience than these other
Yep.
clouds. But each of these domains, AWS, GCP, and Snowflake, has an associate level cert, which is kind of a general purpose cert intended to help you to get your feet wet in the cloud and get you some really strong core skills. So, for example, on GCP, you have the Associate Cloud Architect cert. On AWS, you have Associate Solutions Architect. Snowflake has their Snow Pro Core cert. And each of these is intended to help you to get just skills that are going to be useful across a variety of domains. And so, for example, if you eventually want to pass the GCP Pro Data Engineer cert, it's good to have that foundational associate cert, because the material on the associate cert will show up on the advanced cert too. And so instead of trying to learn it all at once and pass it all at once, you might as well take that first bite, show that you have that stuff mastered, and then go to the pro level cert afterward. You actually had a somewhat different experience, because when we first started on GCP, they didn't have associate certs.
No,
so
I had to jump right into. I jumped right into data engineering cert and passed it. I can't say it was a fun experience, but I did it anyway, and I was fortunate enough to pass that gauntlet on my first try. But I don't think I'd recommend that to anybody, because there's a certain level of progression, right? And so if you
Right.
can if you can take the time and just understand, again, you want to understand, how does this cloud want me to do stuff?
Exactly.
GCP has a different way of doing stuff, right? So the way it sets up organizations and projects and roles and everything is just fundamentally different than how you would do stuff in, say, AWS. Like it's very different. Networking is different
Yeah,
in
dramatically
GCP,
different.
right?
Yeah.
Like storage is different. There's a lot of things that are different, but there's also a lot of things that are the same. So I think coming into it with an AWS cert, the GCP data engineering cert, I would say, like, at least gave me some context, but there's still a lot of things I had to learn, right? But I think starting with an associate level also like allowed me to figure out, okay, so like what are the commonalities between these two clouds, and like what do I need to focus on in GCP and learn, just not only just to pass the test, but also just to be like functioning and performing in GCP. And so having that context of like one cloud, I think also sets you up to understand other clouds. Because like I said, there are certain things that are different, quite a few, but there's also a lot of commonalities. Like the fact that every cloud has the notion of like regions and zones and high availability and all these other, and security. Security is very similar across all the clouds. Everything is like identity access management, so forth, right? So I think it almost like, as I was studying for the Azure data engineering cert and had to take a bit of a detour on that, but I would say studying for that, I was passing the exams, the practice tests, like pretty much off the bat. Like, and it was simply because I knew all the underlying concepts.
Right.
It was more of a matter of, okay, so like what's the name of the technology I need to apply to this question? But understand the underlying principles of like hotspotting in a database, for example. If you've done this enough, you kind of get it, right? And so you're able to just answer those types of questions. But then when it comes to very specific product names, like, yeah, of course you're going to fail that because you don't know what they are.
Yeah.
You'd randomly be guessing. But understanding like best practices, like I said, if you've been in the cloud long enough, and especially if you've done these certs, like going into a third or even second one's going to be far, far easier.
Yeah. I think something I had in my notes that I wrote up about this earlier too is that as you're deciding what cloud certs to get, think about your current job and your career right now, but also think about where you want to be in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you're doing stuff on GCP right now, but you really want your next job to be on AWS, you might want to think about getting a couple of AWS certifications to start moving in that direction.
This question actually came up from somebody. I think somebody asked. It was a question that actually came up last weekend. Somebody messaged me and asked, "Okay, so I have a career question for you."
Yeah.
I get a lot of these now. And the question was, okay, so my company is doing on-prem Windows, and I eventually want to move into the cloud, but I'm offered another job with this other company doing AWS. I've never done AWS, but I'll have no support because I'll have no team. It's just me. And I was like, well, I don't think you should take that job because you're not going to have the support, for one, and two, you don't know AWS or cloud. So like you're basically going to be set up to fail. My recommendation to him was like, look, if your company's in on-prem Windows, there's a pretty good chance at some point they want to go to Azure. Start studying for the certs in that, and then just lead the charge with your company. You'll have a lot of knowledge about Azure that you can start sharing with your coworkers and your team. and lead the charge into the cloud. And plus, if they don't want to work with you, you still have Windows skills, which I think translate pretty well to Azure.
Yep.
And then you can find another job at a place that's doing Azure. And once you're in there, whether you go to AWS or whatever, I think that's your decision. But sometimes you got to take the lead in this stuff too. So
yeah, agree. But you bring up a very important point here, which is that Azure is heavily Windows based. Even if you're doing Linux software development, their whole permission system, for example, is based around Active Directory. And so if you're kind of Windows engineer, Windows developer, Azure might be a good place to start just because everything is going to be easier with that movement. Doesn't mean you can't move to another cloud later. But in general, even though AWS and GCP support Windows to some extent, everything is based around Linux. That's just central to everything they do, plus their own custom permission models on top of that.
Yeah, exactly. I think another thing we want to bring up too is, there are other third-party certs as well, right, that aren't attached to the clouds, but work in the clouds. So some of our partners, for example, like Confluent, Matillion, Fivetran, Looker. I mean, all these companies have their certification process. So if you work at a company that is a partner with these companies, you might be expected to obtain certifications, with these third-party technologies. So keep that in mind as well. Like, the certifications aren't just the universe of like AWS, Azure, and GCP like we described. There's a bunch of others. About a month ago, I did the Fivetran one, just one random Saturday because I'm such an exciting guy. And but I think at the same time, I learned a lot about Fivetran that I actually didn't know about. And I probably wouldn't have taken the time to know about, but actually has come up in subsequent calls where like that scenario on that test like actually showed up, and that I was able to think through it a lot better than I would have if I hadn't been through that experience. Does that mean you have to do these tests? Probably not. I would say do them if you're required to do them. But these like, kind of like third party searches they don't have the to be blunt, they don't have the value in the marketplace like a AWS and Azure or GCP cert does, right? Like
right.
Maybe specifically if a company needs you to have that cert, that could come up. But typically I would see that scenario being that potential employer is also a partner with these companies and they're trying to increase the stack of the people who have certifications. So
Snowflake is kind of the exception.
I was going to say Snowflake is the exception.
Yeah, it's they're not a cloud provider, but they run across all the clouds. And that means, and you saw the IPO this year, you've seen Snowflake's valuations, you've seen their growth. There are a lot of jobs out there that call for a Snowflake certification. In fact, when we work with clients on Snowflake, it's immediately evident that having that certification would help them. And we encourage them, like, look, you're getting a Snowflake, you're moving your data warehouse to this technology. Consider getting some people certified and possibly hiring some certified people with experience.
Yeah.
It's way easier to use than a more traditional on-prem data warehouse, but there is still a lot of minutia that you need to understand well to make the product.
There's a lot of minutia. A surprising amount. I mean, we've both done we both have the Snowflake certification, right? And I would say, I wouldn't say it was the hardest exam I've ever done, but it definitely forced you and I to learn new things that we wouldn't have learned. And guess what? These things pop up in real life, like all the time, in our engagements. So I think that was a very good investment of our time.
Definitely.
So
now let me get your take on the Looker cert, because the Looker cert is kind of an exception as well, in the sense that one of Looker's main selling points is something that's not very easy to get your head around. And that is LookML, right? Looker comes, in addition to being like this nice dashboarding tool, it comes with a whole programming language that is designed to make business logic more consistent. And the reality is that you really need trained and certified people, or at least trained people with experience, to make LookML work well for your company. Do you think getting a LookML cert is a good career move if that's something technology you want to work on?
There's like the Looker developer cert, right? So I think they have two of them, which is like, I don't have either certification from them, although you have experience. Studied and about to take. Yeah, I have quite a bit of LookML experience. I would think that, like, I've heard through the grapevine that I think it was the Looker business one wasn't. It was kind of like a weird exam.
Okay.
like people at Looker had trouble with it, so that's what I've heard. Can't confirm.
Yeah.
And I think if you're in a situation where you need to get the certification for your partnership, by all means do it. But or if you feel like that process, like I think still studying for it. Again, I think there's like a handful of certs I've studied for, never actually went and got the certification, right? But I still have learned a lot from that
Yeah,
process.
yeah,
Just because having to study for something is a very efficient way of learning something, or it can be. I guess it depends on how you like to learn. But when you're forced to learn something, it's pretty amazing how much you start learning. It's weird how that works. When you put the time in, you get something out. And so I would say like just understanding even how Looker prefers doing stuff, right? Like I don't think that the time I invested studying and not obtaining a cert was a waste of time. I think that it's helped quite a bit, with consulting engagements. So
yeah. I would definitely say if your company is using Looker, consider getting the cert, and then make sure that people know that you've acquired the skill set, and that should help your career. You could potentially become the internal trainer and like the Looker expert within your company in terms of writing LookML code. And same thing if you want to use it at another job, if you're looking for a new job, maybe consider getting it. And you can have that on your resume and say, hey, look, I've taken the time to actually learn this technology.
yeah. So, yeah, I can say if you're going to put the time into learning it, right? Like my learning style is typical. I'll just go read the manual, like A to
Yeah,
Z on
yeah,
something. Like that's just how I learn. And
yeah,
by doing that, it also forces me to understand the kind of the rationale of like why did they do it this way when they made the
yeah.
product. Sometimes I get an answer. Sometimes I'm more confused than when I started. But
It's a vast amount of information. Yeah,
it's a vast amount. But the thing is, if you go to the source documentation
yeah,
and just
yeah,
start reading, it's amazing how much that clarifies. Again, I'm kind of, I hate to use the word first principles because it's kind of cliched, but I tend to be very first principles in the sense where if I'm going to research something, I tend to go to the source and just start
yeah,
learning it.
yeah,
Third-party materials, I think, are really good. And actually, we should probably talk about how would you study for a cert.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's no substitute for just diving into the docs and then trying it out in the tool and just
Yeah,
understanding it if the documentation's written well.
right.
That said, Matt, how do you recommend people study for certifications?
It depends on the certification. I think our journeys have changed quite a bit because when we first started working with Google Cloud, there were very few materials. Now, to be fair, there were Coursera courses for the data engineering professional certification, for the professional cloud engineer cert. But that's a lot of material to wade through, right? More recently, in the last couple of years, study manuals like study guides have come out, and
Mm-hmm.
they're a couple hundred pages, but they really do focus on the top level, really important topics that you need to know to pass these certifications. So I think a lot of it comes down to what your learning style is. If you like watching YouTube videos to learn things, then maybe look at the Coursera courses. If you prefer reading a book, then look at the study guides for GCP. Um, A Cloud Guru, Linux Academy also have courses, and I think you've had pretty good luck with those.
I have. So we have a Linux Academy subscription, and then
Yeah,
that actually got kind of grandfathered into a Cloud Guru subscription because
right.
a Cloud Guru bought Linux Academy. I will say though, when I was studying for the Azure cert, the data engineering cert, I noticed that there was a fundamental difference between the Linux Academy materials and then a Udemy course that I happened to just pick up for like $11 or something. And
Yeah,
like that Udemy course was actually far better than Linux Academy materials. I think if I, because I passed the data engineering cert, I think my first try in Linux Academy for that cert. And I was like, oh, this shouldn't be that bad. Then I look at the Udemy questions. They're way different and harder for sure. I don't think I passed the first time. Um, and so I would say research and materials. Udemy is actually, I used to look down on it. I actually think there's quite a bit of quality material on there. We use,
yeah.
actually, there's a really good practice test for the Snowflake, core exam that we used. And I think that definitely helped.
That one
So in a
was
lot of
really
cases, the
nice.
question banks are the things you got to watch out for, where
Yeah.
even if you have a lot of study materials, it's still the way you're going to pass a test is to simulate taking a test.
Yes.
I think you only get so far knowing the material because you got to understand how am I going to read this question
Yep.
in a very short amount of time, pick out what I need to know to answer the question, then go through a process of elimination for each of the maybe 4 or 5 answers, and then pick, okay, so not this answer, not this answer. So it's a question of like maybe A and B. Which one is it? reread the question, dial it in, answer it, hope you got it right, move on. So,
Yeah, it's funny for most of these exams, the questions are highly scenario based and they're very finely sliced logical questions. In other words, you need to read exactly what that scenario says. And then it's not necessarily black and white. It's like, okay, this option B is somewhat better than option C based on the exact list of criteria
yep.
that was provided. And in practice, that means that you need to know things very deeply. It's not enough to just know a list of commands and a list of
Mm-hmm.
terminology, because they're not going to ask you like, what is Snowflake's terminology for a computing cluster that runs queries?
Right.
It should be a warehouse, right? They won't ask you anything like that. It's like, oh, so how do you set up, what type of scaling do you want to use for this particular client scenario?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think finding good quality questions is a great way to prepare. It's tricky because the quality of practice questions is very uneven.
Well, and you don't know until you take the exam and have something to compare against. That's the other problem, right? So you could have spent all this time going through these practice tests, and they may not have done you much good, or they might have helped a lot, right? So it helps to look at the reviews for these things too, and look at the not just the stars, but the written reviews. If there's a lot of them, then I take the time and read through it, because again, this is an investment not just of your money, but of your time, most importantly, because it's you're going to be studying for this, and then you're going to hopefully pass this exam your first time, because in a lot of cases, these certifications, the retake policy is such that so if you fail, you might be able to take it again in 2 weeks. But after that, depending on the company, whether it's AWS or GCP, you may or may not have the ability to continually retake on a frequent basis. AWS, I think, lets you retake it 2 weeks perpetually until you pass. In GCP, you only get a handful of tries in a year, and if you bonk all those, like, you're kicked to the next year, and you better find a different cert. But if your company needs you to get the cert, this becomes a bit of a problem for you. So you better be very ready to pass on your first try.
Yeah. I would also say like Medium articles, YouTube videos by people who have passed the exam and talked about their learning journey are very useful, because they'll tell you what materials they used. They'll say, I found the documentation to be only somewhat useful, but I found the study guide to be extremely, or whatever their particular experience is. Obviously, your experience may differ, but get takes from a couple of different people and design your own learning path by doing so. And then see how quickly you're acquiring the knowledge by using whatever study tools you've decided on, and adjust as you go along.
Right. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Anything else you want to cover on this?
I think that's about it. I mean, we could keep talking about certifications all day.
Yeah, and like everything we do is probably just worthy of a blog post. But
yeah.
But yeah, I think to recap, certifications are great. If you're going to be in the cloud, we recommend getting them at some point in your career.
Yeah.
So, because they have value in the marketplace, and you're going to learn something. I don't see any downside to doing it, actually, except for time.
Yep. And you can start with an associate level cert. In fact, we recommend that you do.
Or even lower. You can do like the intro.
Cloud practitioner.
Cloud practitioner, right?
Just go take it, go study a little bit and take it, because that will give you a sense of the AWS ecosystem, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm. I think Azure's got their, what is it? AZ900 or whatever the hell it's called. It's like the fundamentals of Azure, like that one. It's like not that hard. It's just matching names, right? But at least then you can walk into you can evaluate Azure or AWS as competently, right?
Yes.
You're not just going in and being, oh, what? That sounds like a cool product. We'll go with that one.
Right.
So like Quantum Ledger, let's use that for our app.
We'll use that for our analytics database, right?
Quantum Ledger. Because it sounds awesome. So yeah, if you know what to look for, then this helps, and the search will help you get there. So, cool. I think it's a good place to end it. But we'll see you next Monday. Sure, we'll have more fun things to talk about. So,
sounds good.
All right. Well, take care. All right, see you.
Take care.